Okay, I think I can start here. So, good evening and welcome to Inclusive Product Week. My name is Irina from Code for San Jose. I'll be responsible for hosting today's session, and we will take QA questions after the presentation. So, feel free to submit those in the Q&A tab. I'm glad to welcome Anna Cook, who will present Accessibility for Designers. Anna is a senior product designer that specializes in building inclusive experiences. Over 9 years of experience, Anna is dedicated to creating scalable systems to support accessible practices across product teams, from design to quality assurance. Anna is currently a senior accessibility designer at Northwestern Mutual and NMS and NMS student in creative technology and design at the Atlas Institute of CU Boulder. Welcome to the stage, Anna.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Let me go ahead and share my screen here and make sure I have everything set up right. And could you just tell me I've got things, you can see things and we're running clear? I think I can see it.
Yes, everything is perfect.
Awesome. I'm just not used to hopping. Great. So hi, everyone, and welcome to our chat about accessibility for designers. I'm so grateful to be able to join all of you for Inclusive Product Week and to celebrate Accessibility Awareness Day, Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And before we get started, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about myself and my background. My name is Anna, and I use the pronouns she or they. I'm a senior accessibility designer at Northwestern Mutual and an MS at the Atlas Institute of CU Boulder. In academia and industry alike, I've chosen to specialize in designing digital experiences that are as inclusive as possible, specializing in accessibility. In my free time, I'm an artist, gamer, and writer. I have two adorable cats shown here named Felix and Onyx. You may see one or both of them running around in my background today. Over the past 9 years of my career, learning about inclusive design has been fettered with blockers and educational gaps. Learning about accessibility as a designer can be hard, and accessibility is so important to our work and our practice. So it's my ambition to help unblock designers, developers, and tech folks who want to build better, more inclusive experiences. Today, we're going to talk about what accessibility means for designers in particular, and a lot of that's going to include us talking about some basics. We'll focus on the most essential elements of accessibility in design so that you can be empowered to have more conversations about it and to begin integrating accessibility into your work. And as mentioned, we're going to have time at the end for questions, so don't worry. I will make sure we can have chances to dive in deeper into what you're wondering about. Okay, so why should our products and our work intentionally include accessibility considerations? Well, you might already be sold into accessibility and its value, but regardless, I want you to be prepared to sell it no matter where you're at or who you're talking with. Accessibility advocacy is a big part of my job, along with making designs more accessible. Even organizations bought into the value of accessibility need reminders, and individuals are learning too. So it's a constant conversation, education, and awareness. Our understanding of disability is also always growing, adapting, and changing as our society changes. Knowing why accessibility matters is about making the case for it wherever we are with whomever we're speaking with. So if we look at successful businesses like Apple, IBM, and Microsoft, we can see they all have years of ongoing dedication to accessibility, which has helped them capture larger portions of their markets. Heck, Google and Apple both in the past few days have just announced some updates to their products, including accessibility features, in honor of Global Accessibility Awareness Day. So it's really becoming a big part of our products, especially these days. And any of us can talk about why we love our iPhones and our PCs or our Androids, but we can forget that some of the reasons we love these products is because of those features born out of accessibility considerations. Like iOS's Siri is one instance of something that was partnered or really built with accessibility in mind. Accessibility has been shown to help organizations create amazing products and experiences by driving us to innovate. And doing this means that our products can win against competitors and capture often overlooked portions of the markets that we're in, while reducing our legal risk and, most importantly, serving our users' real needs. For a recent example of accessible design, we can look at Nike's new Go Fly Ease sneakers, which were designed to allow people to put their shoes on without using their hands or bending over. The backstory on this is that a few years ago, 16-year-old Matthew Walzer wrote a letter to Nike's design director asking for a shoe he could put on independently with his cerebral palsy. Walzer wrote in the letter, "My dream is to go to college, the college of my choice, without having to worry about someone coming over to tie my shoes every day." Now, once Nike received this letter, they began developing the sneaker in partnership with Walzer and delivered their first release of the product just a few months ago. These shoes have become popular for many people with a range of disabilities and situations because the design enables ease of use for all. Now, these shoes are currently sold out, and we don't know when they're going to be restocked, which is kind of a different issue. I really hope that Nike's team releases more soon and prioritizes disabled people buying them first and foremost. But what we are seeing is that they're sold out and they're very, very popular. People are asking for these. In most situations, this is an example of how usability and accessibility are linked. In most situations, there's no need to differentiate between the two because their goals are very complementary. Inclusive design is just better design, and accessibility is a form of inclusive design that prioritizes the needs of disabled people. But another thing about designing with disabled people in mind is that 15 to 20% of the people across the world are disabled. Accessibility isn't a special need, as some folks may think. It's just a need. It's not an edge case, it's core functionality. And so when you're having conversations, be prepared to say that. It's not an edge case. This is something that people need right now using your products. And just last year, 98% of the web had accessibility issues. That means that most of our experiences are underserving at least a quarter of the population. And let me ask you, if you knew you were underserving that many of your users in some way, shape, or form, or losing out on that many opportunities, would you accept that? Or would you do everything in your power to change it? Well, you'd probably change it, and that might be why you're here today. But we don't want to change that because as designers, we're here to serve our users' needs. That's why we do what we do. Every day as designers, we make choices that impacts people all over the world. We can see the impacts of those choices in the software and websites and products we're making, but we can also see the systemic impacts of inaccessibility everywhere. And aren't we designers because we want to change the world and make it better? We want our work to have a positive impact, no matter what we're doing. We want our work to make a difference in people's lives, and we want it to impact, every single one of our users in the most positive way possible. So remember, and in these conversations that you may be having with others, that we have disabled users now. You have disabled users now. And we're going to have disabled users who have these needs as long as there are people. Accessible designs are also just better for everyone because many of us are disabled or will become disabled in our lifetimes. Accessibility isn't for an unknown or ambiguous user. It's for ourselves, our families, our friends, people in our lives. The persona spectrum shown here, sourced from Microsoft's Inclusive Design Toolkit, shows how accessibility can help people with permanent disabilities such as blindness, temporary disabilities such as cataracts, and even situational disabilities like distracted driving. The same logic can be applied to our users who can be experiencing a range of situations that affect how they interact with our sites and products at any given time. Anytime I'm watching, a tutorial video or I'm watching something on Netflix, I, even though I'm not hard of hearing or deaf, use captions because I prefer them, especially because it helps me process what's being said. And so it's something that it's benefiting me, even though I'm not necessarily the user that it was originally designed for. When I start thinking more about accessible design, I can notice places where it benefits me just like that all of the time. Ramps benefit me, curb cut sidewalks benefit me, transcriptions benefit me, and having all of these resources can help everyone. And that's really the point of this persona spectrum shown here. By designing for disabled users, we empower all users. And if you think about it for a few minutes or challenge those around you to think about it, feel free to put in the chat, by the way, what things can you think of that that benefit you, that maybe weren't originally designed for you? Maybe they were designed for somebody who is disabled, or maybe they were designed for you because you have a disability. What are some things you can think of that fit that description? Now, yes, building things with accessibility in mind makes them better for everyone. But regardless, accessibility is a fundamental human right. People use our products to get healthcare, pay bills, get jobs, and yes, have fun. It's not a matter of accommodation when the designs we put out in the world might be the only way people have access. A lot of us are working on getting COVID vaccines right now, but what happens when you're trying to get a vaccine or schedule one and the site's inaccessible? This actually is happening right now. Winn-Dixie is a site, or excuse me, an experience that's allowing people to register for vaccinations that isn't accessible currently. And it's a recent lawsuit that has come out, if you are interested. So what happens when we create experiences that marginalize people by design? We as designers create disability when we design without accessibility in mind. We disempower people with our inaction, and people feel that exclusion. They become aware of that very quickly. But again, we have the power as designers, as product teams, as marketing teams to make our work more inclusive now, more accessible and more scalable by building in accessibility. We're in a time, super fortunately, where it's easier than ever to do. On the other side of the coin, a dedication to accessibility is also going to protect our organizations from potential accessibility lawsuits, as I mentioned with Winn-Dixie. If you're wondering if we are accountable to web accessibility from a legal standpoint, the short answer is yes. According to the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, for Americans, at American-owned companies, we are legally obligated to build accessible products. The ADA basically states that if a business is a public place of accommodation, then overall accessibility, digital or otherwise, is expected. And depending on what your product does, who it's serving, where it's being served at, there are probably other laws to consider. For example, Section 508, relating to government entities. Now, in my opinion, avoiding a lawsuit is not the first or most important reason for accessible practices, but it's one to consider and one that our organizations and our stakeholders pay close attention to. As our society leans further into digital platforms, we've seen an increase in website accessibility lawsuits. And since we know that 15 to 20% of the population has a disability, we know that this is a risk our organizations can absolutely face. The cost of a web accessibility lawsuit can have a huge range, with costs coming from both the litigation itself and the cost of being required to fix accessibility issues on a tight timeline. One of the first examples, I was just talking with my new lead today about the Australian Olympics, and this being a perfect example of this happening in the year 2000, where they released a site using Flash. Ooh, that's a scary word, using Flash, and they had to make fixes to that website on a really tight timeline because disabled people couldn't use it. So it's been happening. This litigation's been happening for decades. Wouldn't we rather start by building accessibility into our work now, rather than getting in trouble for discriminating against our users and having to fix our work? So when you're having conversations about accessibility and learning more, know that we are required to create accessible work now. So these are some of the reasons for accessibility, but what does accessible design look like in practice? To make our work accessible, the first thing we need to understand is who we consider when we create accessible designs. Earlier, we talked about the persona spectrum, where we noticed how accessibility benefits everyone with a range of disabilities or situations. But accessibility isn't about designing or developing for everyone. It's about designing with, and specifically with, disabled people. The benefit of that, of course, is that, as we discussed, this impacts everyone and makes a product easier for everyone to use. But let's focus in on who we should be thinking about specifically when we're working towards accessibility. There are many types of disabilities, some of them more well-known than others, and some of them better accounted for than others currently. Our goal with accessibility should be to design with all disabilities in mind as much as possible. The first group of people we'll focus on are people with vision disabilities. Keep in mind that people have a range of vision disabilities, from blindness to vision loss to color blindness, and there's varying degrees of these disabilities. So there could be people who are born blind, people who are becoming blind, people who are losing vision over time. It's not on or off necessarily. And so with that, with people who are using, or rather who are experiencing vision loss, specifically people who are experiencing blindness or degrees of blindness, we have to keep in mind screen reader technology. Screen readers are software designed to announce the contents of a screen, and others, like we talked about, may be native users of screen reader technology and may be users learning to use it. So there's a diverse set of people within our disabled user group. Screen reader accessibility is highly essential in digital experiences where people have traditionally been disadvantaged by visually driven content. So let's take a quick look and listen to an example of a blind user interacting with a screen reader on a web page. Note, just so you know, that this video is going to have audio and it will have some motion. So if you're sensitive to that, just be aware. And it should last about 2 or 3 minutes.
This is Mark Sutton from the University of California, San Francisco's IT Web Services Department. Here today with a brief tour of screen reading technology. I'm a blind person who has been using screen readers, braille writers, scanning equipment, other adaptive technologies since my childhood. What a screen reader does is, for example, I'm going to start to read this page.
Navigation 1. Link, University of California, San Francisco. Link, about UCSF. Link, search UCSF.
And what I will now do is slow down the speech rate.
Rating percent. 75%, 70%, 65%, 60%, 55%, 50%, 45%, 40%. Link, UCSF Medical Center.
So as I was about to say, a screen reader converts what's on a computer screen into information that can be displayed through synthetic speech or braille output. And it does that by allowing you to use a computer instead of a mouse, a computer keyboard instead of a mouse. You can also use a braille display as an input device.
End of navigation.
And what it does is it cleverly determines what's on the screen and present you that
You
information
are
in a way
currently
that would allow for efficient navigation of these pages. So for example, I could just keep reading.
Banner 3 items. Visited, link, image, home.
Line by line, and we could be here all day. Or I could jump to the first heading on the
You are
page.
heading level 2. Search for heading level 2. You are here. Heading level 1. Make videos accessible.
So as I'm moving down through the page, I can look for the category that interests me. And I'm just using
You are
commands built
currently on
into the
heading
screen
level-
reader. So that's all a pretty simple description of what a screen reader is all about. Now I'm going to go over and show a few examples of how that can fall apart. So I have a couple graphics on this page.
Mark Sutton hands on a MacBook Pro image.
So the first one is well described and uses an alt tag
You are currently on it.
to describe what that graphic is all about. Now we go to the next graphic,
Reader 042116.jpg.
much less useful. So it's important to use those elements. It's also true for tables. So I'm going to move to a table.
FDA approved medications. Table 3 columns, 5 rows. FDA approved medications.
So the table is pretty self-explanatory, and I'm going to move into the table.
Medicine. Approved. Column 2 of 3.
And then if I go down into the
Well,
table,
Medicine. Tolbutamide.
and as I
Column
move
1 of 3.
across,
Approved. 1975. Column 2 of 3.
we're getting the labels for the column headers and row headers. So it's important when programming tables, forms, and other elements on the web pages to use the proper HTML codes. I'll go to the
Table 3 columns.
second table on the page,
Medicine. Row 2 of 5 tolbutamide.
and as I'm in the
Tolbutamide.
table, I move across it.
Row. November 1995.
I get a date, but I don't know what that date is associated with. So it's important, as I was saying, to include proper coding tags for all these elements.
Now I'm going to stop us there. I will make sure that you all have access to this presentation later. I would recommend finishing watching it, but showing someone interacting with the screen reader is really important. Excuse me, let me go back. Super important because it helps us kind of get a glimpse into how users are interacting with our content differently. And you might be thinking, well, he's talking about code and semantic HTML, but we have to connect our designs with that logic and with that programmatic indicator. And so there are places where that comes up. You might have also noticed that Mark started with this Mr. Sutton started this with a very fast reading of the page that he was on. And many screen reader users, specifically ones who are more familiar using a screen reader, have become used to it and use really fast speeds to skim a page and find the content they're looking for, just as a sighted user does. So it's really interesting. I highly recommend just taking time to try out screen readers, try out keyboard accessibility. Those are about. And as we talked about, there's also going to be people who have low vision and need things like zoom functionality to look at our content. So things like the ability to zoom up to 200% are going to be really important for our users, and making sure that we're designing that in with things like responsive design is really important. So what we're showing here are some examples of field vision loss, where some folks have different types of vision loss. Now, people generally speaking have a field vision of approximately 180 degrees from left to right, and then 150 degrees up and down, with the sharpest vision being the central 5 degrees and the color vision being the central 20 degrees. Now, some people, as we're talking about here, have a smaller field of vision, which, as we mentioned, field loss is what it's called. So on the left, we have an example of looking at a page with central field loss. We have in the middle example of peripheral, field loss, and then other types of field loss are included as well. And there are other types of vision disabilities that affect how people interact and view our content. There are also people who are colorblind, which comes up a lot when we're talking about design accessibility, because we're thinking about how color contrast is applied. We're also thinking about not using color as a singular way to convey information. Color blindness affects about 4.5% of the population. So it's a pretty large percent of users compared to, excuse me, lost my train of thought. A large percent of users, we will say. Now, as I mentioned, be mindful of how we're applying color, and there are a lot more things to consider here that I do recommend looking into. Another key group of people to keep in mind are those who are deaf or hard of hearing. Again, deafness, like blindness, can have a range between partially deaf to complete deafness. Either way, remember not to rely on audio to indicate the meaning in any context. Now, this could be videos, podcasts, webinars, music, and more. I have another video here, and we're going to show, in this case, captioning and British Sign Language. This video is going to last about 30 seconds. There's going to be a little bit of flashing lights, so just be aware of that if that's something you're sensitive to.
This is bad. Something's not right. This could be an emergency.
Stop panicking. Okay, it's probably nothing. We don't want to waste anybody's time.
Hang on. According to this forum, it could be indigestion. Or an exploding appendix.
Don't listen to this guy.
I really don't know what to do. Okay, go.
Just chill out, man.
When you're not sure what to do, go straight to NHS 111 online. And if needed, a healthcare professional will call you. Help us help you know what to do.
So that's just an example of a video with, again, captions and BSL, British Sign Language interpretation. Having a combination of both can be super helpful, especially because some folks who are deaf or hard of hearing prefer using sign language, and so it's definitely something to consider. Now, as designers, it depends on what we're designing, but it's also our jobs to talk about this need and work with our content teams, especially to make sure that these needs are being met. This is, one more example of how we can work with our teams to make our content more accessible. And you might be noticing that I have captions here using Google Slides automatic captioning technology. So that's pretty neat. We're getting farther and farther along with the capabilities of technologies, automated functionality, but manual functionality there is always going to be the most important. One example of we do want to make sure that we're using products as well that enable us to add captioning. So on YouTube, we have the ability to add captions. Google Slides allows me to have automated captions. So thinking about the tools and the services we're using is important here as well. An example of a product that doesn't have this functionality that's being used a lot right now is Clubhouse. So Clubhouse is audio only, but doesn't have captioning transcriptions for sign language interpretation. Oops. Starts over again. All right. The next group of people to be mindful of are people with motor disabilities like paralysis, muscular and joint conditions, and more. And you might be wondering, how does someone with a motor disability or of motor disability such as this need to be served in a digital context? And there's a lot of answers to this question depending on the platform and the need of the individual, but in general, we want to be thinking about keyboard accessibility and voice interfaces. People with motor disabilities may not use a mouse, and they may prefer to use things like Siri because it requires less physical stress. Others with more severe paralysis, and they put a stylus in their mouth and use that as a way to navigate a keyboard or a touchscreen interface. So we want to avoid things like requiring someone to perform an action in a specific way to do what they need to do, such as, let's say, swipe functionality only. We want to make sure that we provide alternative means for folks who don't use that or have that ability. Another example of something we want to avoid for folks who have mobile disabilities are timed functionality, or rather timed functionality especially that's too brief. So making sure that we allow someone to have enough time to do what they need to do, such as, stay logged into their bank experience. We're going to show one more video. This one's really short, it's 15 seconds, and it's going to show someone using a stylus. It has very minimal motion.
This is how I use my phone. A woman in a power wheelchair uses a mouth stick to operate a smartphone that's sitting on the table. AbleThrive. Hashtag this is how I. Share yours today.
Let me replay that one because I was missing the captions.
This is how I use my phone.
A woman in a power wheelchair uses a mouth stick to operate a smartphone that's sitting on the table. AbleThrive. Hashtag.
So it's really interesting. We have a diverse set of users who are definitely using our experiences in ways that suit their needs best. It's super awesome and important to think about that. And if you can build that into your personas, even better. Oops, there we go. Another group of people to keep in mind are people with speaking disabilities and cognitive disorders which affect speech. In this case, a lot of our interactions focus on voice interfaces, which are becoming more prevalent and more popular, and ensuring that our voice detection tools can work with people who have speaking disabilities and even people who are learning a new language. We want to make sure our products do not just offer things like phone numbers to talk to people over the phone as a way to communicate with our organizations. We want to make sure, again, we're all offering alternative means of access. So not limiting someone to having a spoken conversation to get assistance, for example. And again, this is another context where captions are really important. They can be really helpful for people who are learning, again, a new language, or help others understand what might be said by someone who has a learning disability. And you may be noticing a trend, right? Making sure to not rely on voice interactions here. Again, alternative means of access are key. Oh, I have one more video. I lied. I'm going to call out Google's Project Euphoria. I really, in this case, what I'm going to do probably is go ahead and skip this just to make sure we have enough time for the rest of our content and for questions. But this is a video I've included in my presentation that shows Google's AI using speech-to-text interaction, where someone has a speaking disability and interacts with the tool, and the tool interprets what's being said visually in text on the screen. Again, just the amazing power of technology that we have that's setting us further than we've ever been. And there's a lot of opportunities there for us to be thinking about our users and mindful of their needs. Oops, I keep accidentally playing them. Last, but certainly not least, we want to keep in mind folks who have cognitive disabilities. People with cognitive disabilities tend to be the least understood in the context of product design and development, as well as web design and development, and really the design of choice architecture everywhere. Now, these include people with autism, attention deficit, dyslexia, seizure disorders, and more. Now, I know there are a lot of things to keep in mind when it comes to serving people with cognitive disabilities, because there are a varied set of individuals with individual needs in this set. But in this case, I generally mention improved usability as a whole is really valuable in this context. Often the things that we call better UX directly correlate with improved accessibility for people with cognitive disabilities, like better copy, readability of text and typefaces, strong hierarchy, clear navigation, structure, consistency, all of those play a really big part in serving our users with cognitive disabilities. We also have more and more content coming out and more guidelines coming out designed to help us better understand how we can serve those folks. And so, I would highly encourage you, if it's something you're interested in, to look into it and research it. It's really, really interesting. Which this brings us to our last section today. Part 3, following web accessibility standards. So now we understand why we need to think about accessibility. We understand the core base of users that we're designing for when it comes to accessibility. But you might be thinking, wow, that's a lot of people with a lot of different needs. How can I design and develop design and develop content with disabled people in mind to the fullest extent possible? Well, the good news that I have is that we have a lot of great web accessibility standards, and I'm going to help you try to break those down so you can start using them day to day in your practice. So let's talk about how this works at a high level for yourself and for your team. And when it comes to following accessibility practices online, the best place to start is, of course, with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. WCAG is a set of specific standards designed to make the web more accessible to people with disabilities. These have been around for decades. The guide can be used to evaluate things like marketing sites, our favorite blogs, a web app, a native app, and really anything that can be accessed online. These guidelines are continually being iterated on and developed in partnership with people who have disabilities and who are accessibility specialists. So they are the best place to go when it comes to making sure your content, your designs, and your development are accessible. Now, WCAG is broken into 4 guiding principles, stating that web content must be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, spelling the acronym POUR, or POUR, the core principles. Now, perceivable means removing barriers to accessing our content by, you guessed it, providing alternative methods of access. Some examples of this include things like video captions for a person who is hard of hearing or deaf, or support for screen reader technology for someone who's low vision or blind. Now, in the example on the right, I'm showing an example of captions turned on. And you can actually find things like this helpful in many contexts. So using captions, that can be really helpful for a lot of different users, as we discussed. Operable means that our content, along with anything interactive on it, can be controlled through various tools. For example, ensuring our content is accessible to people who don't use a mouse to navigate and instead rely on their keyboard. The video earlier with Mark Sutton showed us that he was using a keyboard to interact with the pages while using screen reader technology. So making sure that our content structure aligns closely with our development structure and that we're using semantic code to align those closely together is going to be really, really important. A common example of this use case benefiting everyone is form fields, for example. So using the ability, or rather having the ability to tab or navigate with your keyboard between form fields in a form is something that a lot of users use, just because having to click from form to form form item to form item is kind of tedious. So again, another example of how this type of functionality is going to benefit everyone. The third is understandable, meaning using language and functionality that's consistent and easy to comprehend. So, for example, before using the acronym WCAG, I explained that WCAG stands for the World Content Accessibility Guidelines, so that I'm not assuming that you know what it means or that you remember what it means. Guidelines like this may seem like a given, but a lot of organizations tend to struggle with clarifying consistent meaning and context. Another instance of understandability in practice is using consistent components, for example, in your design systems. So say, making sure that you're using a primary call to action button to indicate the most important thing to be interacted with in a single viewport, and using that consistently. Lastly, robust means that our content should work well across different platforms, technologies, and devices within reasonable limits. For example, our products and sites should be accessible on different browsers such as Chrome, Firefox, or Safari. I just found out today that Microsoft is going to legacy Internet Explorer, which is kind of wild, June 2022. But that's a little bit of a non sequitur. We still want to make sure we're supporting these browsers, Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and Microsoft Edge. More relevant, we could talk about the increase of purchasing through mobile platforms and through responsive experiences. Robust is going to apply here. Specifically, making sure that our content is responsive and making sure that people who aren't necessarily accessing content through their desktop can use their mobile devices, their smart devices, and more to access that content. We see a lot of e-commerce being driven by these decisions because a lot of people are using their smartphones to do things like making purchases. So making sure we empower users to do that is important. So again, our principles are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. These 4 principles act as categories that hold all of the guidelines from WCAG. You don't need to memorize the guidelines, but understanding them can frame the context for all of the guidelines, and we can use them to make our experience more inclusive. And the primary reason that I bring up WCAG, is because a lot of designers ask me for a simple accessibility checklist. Well, WCAG is the most simple accessibility checklist. While there are some, things that can, take time to understand and interpret, it is robust and thorough. It is the ultimate accessibility checklist. So I bring up WCAG because I want people to use it. So by breaking down WCAG with you all today, and these principles, those 4 principles, my hope is that you'll be able to get value from this list and to start using it sort of in your practice day to day, checking things off internally or talking them through with people as you're designing experiences. Some of them aren't even going to be applicable to certain circumstances. So just be mindful, it's actually over time something that can be very easy to include in your process. Now, goodness gracious, in the example we have here, I have the first principle on the left, perceivable, highlighted, and all of the guidelines that fit within that below in the sidebar navigation. And each item, as shown here, and as I talked about, will apply in specific circumstances. For example, we have highlighted here guideline 2.1.1, which relates to keyboard accessibility. So we've got our principle, operable. I don't know why I said perceivable. We have our principle, operable. We have our guideline, which is 2.1.1 keyboard. And then we have one more thing, the acceptance level shown here. Now, to help us understand what guidelines are most essential, every WCAG item has a rating of A, AA, or AAA. The A to AAA levels indicate the level of compliance met with each guideline. Essentially, an A rating is like the bare minimum, a AA rating is good, and a AAA rating is great. As a team or as an individual, you'll want to choose what level you seek to meet and then use that as a benchmark for how accessible your design should be. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't try to shoot for AAA if you are, using AA as a benchmark, but it can help you and your organizations kind of set the bare minimum context. Now, for reference, most organizations choose AA as their bare minimum compliance level. And as I will call out here, there is no experience that is entirely AAA compliant in every category or every location. Most experiences have a range of accessibility compliance levels, and different pieces factor into our design accessibility, such as what is on a page or what component is being used. So let's break that down a little bit. To provide context, I've broken out compliance levels using color contrast on a button as an example. We have 4 different buttons with different shades of gray on a light background and a dark background. Now, I have a rating with each of these that shows how high of contrast there is, or if it's compliant with our contrast accessibility standards. As you can see, or rather not see, the first button on the top left is invisible. It does not meet acceptance levels on a dark background, but looking to the right, the same color button has a AAA rating on a light background. And we can see similar instances depending on how the color's applied. WCAG color contrast compliance it's indicated in guidelines 1.4.3 and 1.4.6. It only has AA and AAA levels. So you would want to shoot for at least a AA compliance level. Now, ideally, we might want to meet AAA, but AA is going to work just as well. And as shown here, it's not a bad place to be by any means. So how we apply WCAG and what guidelines we consider essential really depends on our goals, our designs, and our components themselves. This part is why I tend to recommend looking at these types of considerations on a component level using our design systems as a place to start. It's easiest for me and for organizations to scale accessibility to when applying it in that context within a design system and starting there. There are many items outlined in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and many of them relate to design just as much as they do development. And so that's why I encourage you to learn more about WCAG and what guidelines live in there. Even though our earlier example, our example a moment ago, was focused on something we commonly think of with accessibility, color contrast, there's more than color contrast to keep in mind, and what WCAG is not just for developers. Accessible design is just about as much about UX as it is about UI. Some other standard accessibility requirements that need to be outlined in design include color usage, content strategy, heading structure, link behaviors, hover and focus states, form behaviors, everything on this list and more. So when you're looking at your designs, I recommend using WCAG's quick reference guide and having it open. Again, just kind of doing your checklist and saying, okay, do I need to meet this guideline? No, I can move on to the next one. Do I need to meet this guideline? Yes. Are we meeting this guideline? Are we not meeting this guideline? How can we meet this guideline? So I always recommend having that open, and I will share a resource for using in that context. Let's take a moment to actually apply this to a component looking past the UI and looking at UX accessibility. This alert component is designed to have a set of different types of messages: success, warning, information, and error. There are a couple of UX items we can investigate with this alert. For example, we can ask ourselves, how is the meaning of this alert indicated to blind users? Since we have icons in these alerts, and icons can have alt text, perhaps we want to use these icons to convey that meaning. If we're using these icons elsewhere, and we want to convey that meaning the same way elsewhere, we can also say, hey, this alt text should apply anytime this icon is used. Again, scaling within our design system. So our icon relates in alt text directly to the type of message that's being displayed. Or let's say that you're using the error alert that we just showed, and you're showing, and that shows multiple errors in one alert container. We'll need to ask, does this alert clearly identify what errors need to be fixed, where the errors are, and how they can be fixed? And not just the alert alone, but how does this apply in the context of the entire page? If our alert doesn't do what we need it to do, we can note that it's an issue and relate it to WCAG 3.3.1, error identification. Now, these are just some of the questions that we as designers can and should be asking ourselves when we look at existing components and work to build new ones. We should also be asking these questions when we're doing visual designs, depending on the context and how information is meant to be conveyed. If we have components and designs lined up together and a reference for their context, it can be so much easier for us to look at accessibility gaps. As you're digging into your accessible design practice, I put together some resources and tools to help you get started. The first thing I'll mention here is WCAG's Quick Reference Guide as a fantastic resource that I use all of the time. That is the checklist that I shared with you earlier, where it allows you to see everything that needs to be met within WCAG 2.1, the latest release thus far, and making sure that you're meeting compliance levels. However, if that's not something you're comfortable with yet, that's okay. I've also included the A11Y project checker if you prefer. So give that a try if you'd like to sort of ease into this process, goodness gracious, and get more familiar with it. Another tool I've shown here is WebAIM. It has, in this case, I'm showing the color contrast checker. I use it all of the time, if not just for my own sake, to remember what level of color contrast compliance need to be met for large text, small text, icons, SVGs, stuff like that. So it's a really great resource, but WebAIM also has a lot of great articles worth referencing here. If you're looking for auditing tools, which I've spoken about before in previous events, I always recommend DQ's Axe Dev Tools or Google Chrome's built-in Lighthouse tool. That can be really helpful for auditing or looking over something in terms of accessibility. And in addition to that, I've included a few articles here that folks have found helpful that I have written and that you can use as a reference when getting started and when digging into more. Now, before I wrap up today, I do want to level set on a couple of things. By speaking with you all today, I wanted it to become easier for you to make inclusive work, but I offer a specialized approach within inclusive design. What we talked about today has been sourced from the voices of many people with varying degrees of disability or means of access, but I want to encourage you to ensure you diversify the voices you listen to when it comes to understanding inclusive design and development. Accessibility is an essential part of inclusivity, but it doesn't make up the whole of inclusive design or inclusive design considerations. Inclusivity at its core is intersectional in nature. Accessibility covers part of this, and it relates to other parts of inclusivity, but it alone cannot meet the needs of people who are marginalized in other ways. So as you take steps to be accessible, just be mindful of the voices of others who are marginalized by racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and more. These are really important things to keep in mind. And yes, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, those get baked into our products just as much as inaccessibility does. And a lot of people who are affected by lack of accessibility are also affected by things like racism or sexism or homophobia or more. So please be mindful of it and know that there's a lot of learning that I have to do there as well. So, so definitely keep digging and try to learn more. Now, finally, I know our time together is brief today. And anytime I talk about accessibility, I always worry that folks are going to go, oh gosh, that's a lot to take in. And it can be, absolutely. I imagine folks out there might be saying, okay, I get this, I want to do this. And I kind of get what you're getting at, but I don't completely understand it yet. And that's totally okay. I want to close our time together today by reminding you what I said at the beginning. 98% of experiences just last year were not really that accessible to disabled users. So if you're sitting there and feeling intimidated or kind of getting that information dump, I want to say you don't have to be perfect to make an impact. Every single effort you make to make your designs and your team work with accessibility is better than nothing. Every time you dig into accessibility, you empower your team to do the same. Every time you have a conversation or ask a question, you educate yourself and your team. Those conversations make us less afraid to push for accessibility and make us less defensive when we're pointing out that something needs to be adjusted. You don't have to be an accessibility expert to be an advocate for accessibility. With that, I'm going to open up the rest of our time for questions. And if for some reason I don't get to your question today, I'll do my best to answer any questions you have. You are more than welcome to reach out to me on Twitter as Anna E. Cook. That's ANNAECOOK at Twitter. And I realize the captioning is not great on this point. However, feel free to reach out to me. Now, I am now opening up officially for questions.
Thank you, Anna. It was amazing presentation. Let's go questions. We have a lot actually.
Oh, good.
So, and the first one is, what are some of the most impactful things a designer can do when joining a team that doesn't currently have a high priority on accessibility?
Great question. It, of course, depends on the team and the organization, but I generally recommend to, at least in my experience, what I have found to be the most beneficial is to not ask for permission to start making your work more accessible and start baking it into your process as much as possible, and to start saying, hey, like I included, like in these designs are making sure to consider WCAG compliance at a AA level, and saying like, hey, this component doesn't meet, accessibility standards. Here's a reference as to what's happening and why, and having those conversations. So I realize it's somewhat cliche to say don't ask for permission, but if you're waiting for someone to give you permission to start making your work accessible, you may be waiting a long time. And the best thing you can do is to start doing everything you can now. So I would say that would be the first thing I would recommend. In terms of other things, start building allies on your team. Start finding people who are interested and want to do this. I find a lot of developers are passionate about this. Folks on the product management or product ownership side often will come to the table when you offer them a seat, so to speak.
Thank you. The next one is, there are widely used inaccessible UI experiences. How do you convince folks to move away inaccessible designs?
Okay. Could you repeat that question?
How do you convince folks to move away inaccessible designs?
Got it. So when it comes to convincing folks to kind of move away from inaccessible UI, I think sometimes part of that is, again, having the kind of those conversations over time and saying like, hey, like this isn't accessible, we need to do this. And if we don't, these things could happen. And if we do, these things could happen. I also find actually in a lot of these contexts, we can use user interviews and user testing to our advantage. Often UI that struggles to have or isn't meeting certain accessibility considerations is going to have usability issues as well. And so if you have the opportunity to speak with folks and to ask them about how any struggles they're having, you can use that to your, to say like, hey, this user struggled with this, this, and this. It's possible that that is related to this item that's not being met, and open up that conversation. There are widely used, I'm thinking as well, inaccessible UI experiences. In terms of like apps and platforms themselves, if you're asking about that, let's talk about Clubhouse, for example. Clubhouse, while many people do love it, other folks find it really difficult to use because it doesn't have captioning, as I mentioned. So how do we convince someone to use a different service or a different platform? Well, offering an alternative is one of the first things I usually will recommend here. Twitter Spaces now is available and does have automated captioning, albeit imperfect, but I would recommend as much as possible when you're saying something has an accessibility issue to offer an alternative and to make recommendations. That usually helps people kind of feel less intimidated by it.
Thank you. Okay. And the next one, I will jump through the two questions. This one is interesting. What do you think about models and their typical voiceover and keyboard accessibility challenges?
Yes. So modals can be kind of tricky in terms of accessibility. And so this is not one of those patterns where I will say like, we should avoid this because, it's generally not accessible. Like, for example, you don't generally want to use things like sliders or automatic sliders or things like that because generally they have baked in issues. Modals, however, can have baked in issues. The thinking that you generally, or I have generally experienced when it comes to modals or dialogues or things that are appearing above in our hierarchy of the page are things like, what should our focus automatically go to in this modal? Are we making sure that that focus is moving to the modal as our view moves to the modal, right? Making sure that we're not, I've seen this happen a lot where the keyboard accessibility doesn't match what's opened. And so the user on a keyboard is still looking through the page and may not know that the modal's open. So making sure that focus, depending on the context, goes to the right place, and making sure that that everything in the modal is clear, that there's the ability to close, ensuring that users, aren't especially surprised by a modal, such as one of the most popular examples is when you go to a site for the first time and it's like, do you want to sign up for our newsletter? Well, no one has triggered that interaction. So that's an accessibility issue. It's a surprise. So I think when it comes to voiceover and other screen reader technology, being mindful of what is in focus when someone is interacting with their keyboard, what is being announced to them and how it's being announced, what order it's being announced in is super, super important with modal accessibility. And of course, making sure that users aren't trapped. So no keyboard traps on a modal, making sure they can, like I said, close, leave, make sure they perform an action and that the actions are clear. This is important not just for screen reader users, but for others as well.
Thank you. And maybe we'll have 5 minutes more. So the next question is how do you approach a team where accessibility was an afterthought? And adding onto this question, how can a designer new in the career and or new in a workplace advocate meaningfully for accessible design practices?
Yeah. So a lot of places have accessibility as an afterthought. In my experience, generally speaking, of course, I have found the best way to approach this is to, I will say briefly, start having those conversations earlier, start building your allies, start building a team, have a guild or accessibility team. But before you get all to that, I usually will say something like, hey, our design system or our experience has a lot of accessibility issues, and show them what I find in an audit and show them how many issues exist on even just one page, and saying like, hey, like all of these things have issues, and this is something we should start thinking about. What I also tend to recommend in this context, when you're getting people to kind of come to the table and gather around and join the accessibility league, is to make sure that when you're talking about stuff like that you're saying, okay, so these are the issues that exist, and we know they exist. How can we start taking them on in a way that's meaningful with the work that we already have? Now, ideally, I want to say this, like, ideally we would fix all of those issues right away. Organizationally speaking, that if an organization hasn't thought about it in the first place, it can be hard to have them do that unless there's, they need to fix things to accommodate due to a lawsuit. So generally speaking, that's how I approach it. Do some auditing, show people what's happening, and then say like, hey, let's try to meet AA compliance by this date by integrating these updates into our components as they're being redesigned, rebuilt, or worked with actively. I obviously, it's not always that easy, but every little thing, again, is going to count there. And that second question, how can a designer new in their workplace or career advocate meaningfully for accessible practices? I think, one, I will say, personally speaking, I'm biased, if you're new in your career and you're advocating for accessibility, I will just start by saying that sets you apart from other candidates. That is something that makes you more hireable, especially to someone like me, but to other designers who understand this, and to other designers who care about stuff, like who want to make better experiences. So I just want to level set there. That's important. But I think a lot of what I've experienced personally is that I am constantly advocating by educating. And that means sharing, presentations and like having an accessibility channel in Slack and getting, sharing, doing an all hands and just showing them basic accessibility work, having a learning series and having videos in there. I think that educational piece is going to get you a long way, and getting buy-in, especially from your managers, your stakeholders, your leadership, pushing as much as possible, making it a part of your goals and communicating them openly and freely and thoughtfully is going to get you really far. Even if it doesn't feel like that at first, it will mean something.
Thank you. And two last questions. Are there accessibility experiences that change depending on your primary language or culture?
Yes. For example, we talked a little bit about sign language interpretation earlier. Well, for a really good example of this exactly is sign language has different languages. So there's American Sign Language, there's British Sign Language, there's Black American Sign Language, which, by the way, super interesting. Highly recommend looking that up. There's, just like all language, subsections of cultures and society that live within it. There are, there's cultures that are or countries that have different ways of interacting with content in general. Like, for example, Japanese characters are written differently, but different countries are, and different places and different cultures are looking at accessibility too. They might be looking at it differently because of the ways that people, naturally understand information or communicate information. But oh man, I'm sure that could be a whole talk that I'd like to do one day. But it does exist and it does happen. There's lots of different variations. And so these are guidelines that generally apply to broader groups.
Thank you. And the last one, are there accessibility guidelines for users that experience anxiety and or depression?
Yes. So WCAG has some level of that baked in. I think where, accessibility and WCAG can sometimes feel like it falls a bit short is in understanding, folks with cognitive, I say cognitive, with, different needs when it comes to mental status and anxiety and depression and things like that. I would loosely say WCAG does meet that at some level, but going above and beyond, I think there are different talks and different books that talk about these specific needs for users. But like, for example, not surprising people with something they haven't triggered, that's one thing. Not having timing that's really intense or tight. There's a lot of different things that come into play. But this is where our accessibility guidelines can sometimes feel like they, like I said, fall short, and where inclusive design might take a little bit more of the rein and pull in. I know some of my colleagues have talked a few times about things like this, or triggers, for example, making sure, as I tried to do, to mention any triggers like in the videos that would occur before they occur, to make sure that folks who experience anxiety and depression or motion sensitivity are aware of that before it starts. So I'm rambling. Long story short, it is not perfect, I think, but that is my opinion. As somebody who experiences these things, I may be biased in that regard.
Thank you very much. That was a great presentation, and thank you for answering those questions. It was a pleasure to have you with us, and
Thank
really
you.
very, very great.
And you were a lovely moderator. Thank you very much.
Thanks. So this concludes the session, and folks, we have 2 more sessions, so you can jump into those sessions. Thank you very much, everyone, and also you can continue the conversation in the session Slack channel. I posted the link, the first link in our chat. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Have a nice evening.